Welcome to our channel Scary Sagas, where we bring you the most amazing true horror stories. Today, we have a bone-chilling horror story that will make your blood run cold. This occurred years ago. I was probably 15 at the time. I am now 22. My grandmother experienced some problems with her pacemaker. She was detained for 8 days at this historic hospital for veterans. Even the hospital itself felt unsettling. When I was taking care of my grandmother, I was never comfortable. Therefore, the hospital permits at least one family member to stay the night and keep an eye on their loved ones. I offered to take care of my grandma because my dad didn't seem to care much. I was quite close to her. I now cherished my time spent in my grandma's ward. It was animated. Although there were at least 15 individuals present, the ward was very, very large. I thus made friends while my grandmother napped. We even watched a movie together using a portable DVD player that someone else brought. The hospital's labyrinth-like layout was what I detested most about it, especially at night. Being lost is simple. Anyway, I was still getting acclimated to the hallways on day 3. My aunt waited with me till dusk, and then she allowed me to go out and get some dinner on my own. I became disoriented because the area resembled a maze. I was in the mortuary when I awoke the next morning. There was a man there, who was probably the facility manager. There was this figure as I was leaving. It was a dark, ethereal form. I followed it out of curiosity as it walked down the corridor. The figure entered the ward before leaving. I was standing in the corridor, very perplexed. After a short while, a man shouted for help from outside, saying that his father was no longer breathing or anything. After getting the chills, I hurried back to my grandmother down the hall. I needed a half hour to locate my grandma's ward. I never shared what I saw with anyone. It would be inappropriate, so I just refrained from speaking. On day 6, my aunt sent me home for the evening with enough food and fruit for my grandmother. I sat on my chair and waited for my grandmother to nod official. The ward was really large and roomy, as I already indicated. We didn't need fans or air conditioning because the windows were so big because the evenings there were quite cold. I always slept with a jacket on and covered my grandmother with 2 layers of blankets. The same chilly night had passed, and everything was peaceful. Everyone was dozing official. For my grandma's hourly medication, the nurse occasionally woke me up, and by 2 a.m., I was no longer drowsy. When the clock struck 3, I was playing on my phone and sensed a gentle breeze on the bed behind me. The black figure reappeared as I turned around. I nearly lost my phone. The elderly woman on the bed was dozing off, and her son or grandchild, I'm not sure, was doing the same. I turned my head aside because I didn't want to watch what was going to happen. When the son awoke at 5 in the morning, and the nurses were rounding for the patient's medications, they discovered that the elderly woman had passed away. I never saw the figure again after that. Perhaps it relocated to another ward. I'm not sure. However, I was relieved that my grandmother was spared at the moment. I used to work in an inpatient unit a few years ago. The majority of people would visit, have an unmanageable symptom treated, and then return home to pass away. We occasionally had patients who would stay all the way to the finish. Most insurers don't cover inpatient hospice treatment. Thus, these patients either paid out of pocket or had excellent insurance, old school UAW employees. Working in this industry has given me a ton of bizarre, spooky anecdotes, but only a few really stand out to me. Joe, a retired employee of an auto factory, was one of our long-term PTS. Joe was a down-to-earth blue-collar worker who I admired greatly. When he liked you, he gave you a nickname and wasn't afraid to tell a dirty joke. Smitty was mine. Given that Smith is my last name, it was an obvious decision. Although not creative, I was happy to receive Joe's approval. Joe had pancreatic cancer. Because he never wed or had children, he didn't want to pass away in his home and, in his words, the house's resale value. Uncertain who received the funds. When his nieces came to visit, they tried to get Joe to join them at home so he could pass away surrounded by his loved ones, but Joe wouldn't have it. I worked my fucking ass off on that fucking line for 35 years. Might as well reap the fucking benefits now. Joe felt at home there, but the majority of people would want to avoid such a clinical environment. Every time I entered Joe's room after finishing my rounds and passing my medications, he would tell me a fresh joke or attempt to convince me to join him for a drink. Yes, some of the patients could request a drink. Doctors have no trouble writing an order for a shot of whiskey or beer when a patient is near death. I won't hide the fact that I grew close to Joe. I played cards during my breaks or listened to his old drinking tales. Almost always both. He was a lovely man overall and had a great gravely laugh that always culminated in a cough. Joe was a low-maintenance patient, unlike the majority of our patients. He required very little nursing and experienced very little discomfort, which is extremely unusual for pancreatic cancer. Our patients frequently experience hallucinations. However, this typically occurs when the patient is deteriorating and other symptoms are present. Joe was always of sound mind and never had mental degeneration. I started my rounds as soon as I got to work one day. All of the rooms are private. I was welcomed with the customary crude joke about my weight or being from the South. Joe only glanced at me with a really perplexed expression. Joe quickly said yeah when I inquired whether everything was all right before returning to his newspaper. I dismissed it and continued with my day. The man was coping with his mortality and the fact that not everything in life is sunshine and jokes. Joe always had that same perplexed expression on his face when I entered his room, and he was very dismissive of me. This continued for the first half of the shift until I eventually inquired about the situation. I will never forget Joe's reaction. Yes, everything is good, Smitty, but I'm not sure about the man who has been following you all day. I worked by myself. I was by myself. I inquired as to his meaning. That tall black man who has been standing next to you all day. I felt uneasy and puzzled. The only male employee working that day was me. I erred by asking Joe if this tall man in black was still with me. I agree, Smitty. He also doesn't seem too happy. My nursing education began to take hold, and I realized that it was abnormal to participate in patients' hallucinations. Joe was composed, undeniably upset, but cool. I couldn't leave the building quickly enough after telling Joe not to worry about him. I'm not much of a believer, so I wasn't sure how to interpret it. Sadly, I gave up and spent the rest of the shift avoiding Joe like the plague. Since Joe passed away that evening, I still regret doing this. The nurse who covered for me shortly after my shift called to inform me that Joe had passed away. Returning to the apartment, I arrived just as Joe's niece was leaving his room. She had red eyes, and I'll be honest, not the best at this part of the job. I expressed my condolences as usual and added, he is in a better place. Joe's niece's eyes flashed with fire as her face swung toward mine. He beat his pregnant girlfriend till she miscarried because he was a drunk jackass. I wasn't all when he said, if he's anywhere, it ain't better than here. Despite our several chats, Joe and I never discussed his history. The niece left angrily. I lingered there for a moment before going in to bid my friend farewell. In bed, Joe was lying down. He was waiting for the funeral home after the employees had cleaned and prepped the body. Even though I'm not particularly sentimental, I grew connected to Joe and felt it would be terrible not to say goodbye. When I approached Joe, I became aware of an odd thing. Most people close their eyes when they pass, but not Joe. Joe's eyes were wide open, and although it may have been the after effects of earlier that day's events and the run with the niece, I do not believe they were anything but frozen in horror. Before leaving, he saw something terrifying. My granny has multiple sclerosis, which prevents her from moving below the shoulders. She can move her head and speak normally, but that's about it. However, she has a beautiful attitude and enjoys making jokes. She resides with my aunt, who takes care of her and receives assistance from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. daily. One day, my mother texted me to let me know that my grandma needed someone to spend the night with her in the hospital since she had an infection. My aunt needs to get ready for school because she has 3 children at home, 2 of which are 5 and 3. At the time, my mother had a truckload because she was moving into a new home that my parents had just bought, but she would spend the day with her instead. My aunt left my grandma in the hospital room with the nurses to take a phone call, but it appears that no one checked on her after they left because she hadn't used the restroom yet and no one had returned to see how she was doing. My aunt had to go back to the hospital to tell her, so she had to wait in her waist till then. She cannot move to press a button, mind you. We didn't think she should be left in the nurse's care because of this. I offered to help because I've volunteered to spend the night at my grandmother's place in the past whenever they needed help or if my aunt ever went on vacation. Although she snores like a beast, I didn't mind too much because I work so much and it felt nice to be able to help out when I could. I was in retail, so I worked that day until 9:30 p.m. I knew I could get to the hospital before her last helper left at 10 p.m. because it took me only 15 minutes to travel there from the mall where I work. I started work at 9:30 a.m., but the next assistant would arrive at 8. I reasoned that I could get ready and arrive at work on time. She appeared to be doing better when I got there, so I bid her caregiver good night. The nurses prepared her for bed as we watched a movie, ending the 4 at 12:30 a.m., and then leaving for the night. She probably slept for 15 to 20 minutes after that. I was complaining to my fiancé via text about how difficult it was to sleep in my chair, and how I wished I had kept track of my blanket and pillow. As I waited for him to answer, I started to nod off from weariness from my long day at work and after driving to the wrong hospital next door before I arrived. Then, I was startled to awaken by strange noises emanating from my grandmother's resting body. She appeared to be talking while asleep at first, but they weren't simple words, rather. It sounded almost like someone was changing the channel on a television. She would start speaking properly but using language I couldn't understand, stop in the middle of a song, and then resume again. Every 30 to 60 minutes, it would occur for a few seconds before ceasing. I made the decision that until I film this, no one will believe me, so whenever I could, I recorded it on my phone. I obtained 2 good videos. The first one, who makes odd noises with her mouth, sounds very regular. The second one seems dreadful. Her voice, which was eerie and deep, was not her own. To put it mildly, I was afraid. I simply kept repeating to myself, If she sits up or moves, I'm running out of here. I tried to see everything in the utterly dark hospital room as I peered at her with my eyes wide open. I was lucky that she never moved. I inquired about her sleep the following morning as I was giving her breakfast. "Fine," she replied. She asked me incredulously, "What the heck was that?" As I replayed the footage I had taken the previous evening, I admitted to her who it was and how frightened I was of her. She dismissed it with humor and denied remembering it. She has never behaved in this way during any of the nights I have taken care of her. Even while it may not be as terrifying as other of these stories, it creeped me out. In the 1990s, my wife's girlfriend at the time worked at an 18th century hospital that had, at some point, been transformed into a palliative care facility for those who were still capable of taking care of themselves but required proximity to medical aid. Low-care apartments were added. These units resembled single-level cabins in a garden setting. Some of the original old buildings were still in operation, and they had many places where there were chilly drafts, difficult to open doors, and other problems. The best one was a door that would close and then instantly open without anyone there to turn the latch. Anyway, a neighbor who also worked there gave my wife a ride to and from work, but on Fridays, that person would finish up at lunch. I would fetch my wife up approximately a 40-minute journey each way so that she could continue working a full day. I always allotted myself an hour to get there because of the unexpected traffic. I would wait on an ancient church pew outside the brick cottage that served as an office. It was a lovely rural environment, and some of the older residents from the low-care sections would wander around and say hello. I eventually got to know Ken after a few weeks. He was 80 years old and lived alone. He had some persistent problems and would stay in the hospital for days at a time before returning home for a few weeks. He figured out my schedule, and every Friday he would be waiting for me in that church pew. I relish our conversation. He had seen and done a lot in his earlier years, and he was full of life experience. He delighted in telling those tales, and I relished hearing them. Ken had a Toyota Celica from the 1980s. Although he was no longer able to drive it, he didn't want to sell it. He would insist the family take him for rides in it whenever they visited. He would often beg me to take him for a drive, but I didn't know the man well and didn't want to get behind the wheel of an unfamiliar vehicle. In addition, I was about 20 minutes away from leaving. Ken played golf frequently. He described how his kid visited him once a week, which my wife corroborated, and how they would go out in the Celica. I believe they were playing golf. Ken would talk about his performance. He would talk to me about hitting a ball deep into the rough or making 3 consecutive birdies. He would also keep track of how many balls fell into the water. Every week was different. Some weeks, after his handicap was taken into account, he would be 3 over. On other occasions, he performed quite well and was 1 under handicap. Although I was familiar with golf because my father and brother played it frequently, I wasn't a fan. His tales were always unique and exceptionally well told. He'd tell me about his time as a young man in the Air Force and anecdotes from World War II after recapping the highlights of the previous week's golf games. He remained an Air Force mechanic for many years, rising to the positions of unit commander and mechanic training instructor. He eventually transitioned into teaching trades at a technical college, where he remained for around 10 years before retiring. He told me tales of fabricating new components out of whatever was available to make things function, of failures, amusing workshop occurrences, and amusing college-era student anecdotes, which provided me with a ton of entertainment. Every Friday, I started leaving earlier and earlier so I could see him more. When I would occasionally show up there and he wouldn't be present, my wife would then inform me that he was spending some time in the hospital. In fact, I began to miss our little conversations. Things started to alter after roughly 9 months of this. We appeared to be returning to normal on this particular Friday because he wasn't in the hospital any longer and was sitting in the pew again. He discussed his golf outing for the week. I quickly excused myself since I had to use the bathroom. He was left by the time I returned. When my wife heard what I had said, she apologized and added, "Though, sorry, I forgot to tell you, Ken passed away earlier this week." However, I had just arrived and was speaking with him before using the restroom. He informed me of the golf match. "How is that possible? Ken, are you certain it's the same?" The next week I observed his car was now parked in the visitor's parking lot instead of its customary location beneath the carport of his unit. It was replaced by a sizable 4WD with a sizable trailer on the rear that was partially laden with boxes and furniture. It forced me to halt, although it appeared to be evidence that he had passed away. I continued to hold out hope that he was still alive and well because we had just spoken a week earlier. His son was emptying out the contents of the apartment when I strolled down to it. I made an introduction. Ken had told him about our Friday conversations, so he was aware of me. He said his father had passed away the previous Tuesday. In order to avoid upsetting him, I remained quiet about how I had spoken to him the week prior, 3 days after he had passed away, but I now had proof that it wasn't Ken's physical body that was seated in that church pew and speaking to me. He continued by saying that his father enjoyed speaking in front of people and hoped he didn't bore me. Actually, the reverse is true. We talked for a while about some amusing War and Air Force anecdotes, and I expressed my admiration for Ken's mental sharpness by telling him about his golf game each week. He appeared perplexed. Playing golf? Yes. He would go into great detail about each game each week. Then, he informed me that Ken hadn't played golf in at least a decade. I was in awe. Then, he said he used to pick up Ken every Thursday, take him to the cemetery to visit the grave of Ken's wife, then take him to a cafe for lunch. After that, he would go grocery shopping, fill up the car with gas, and then drive back to his house. A total of about 4 to 5 hours. How long I would anticipate him to play a round of golf would be. He never once brought up any of those things. I find it amazing that he could describe everything in such detail. The golf tales had to be true events because the play-by-play details he provided were simply impossible to invent. They seem to like that these stories will leave you with more questions than answers. They are a reminder that sometimes the truth is much darker and more mysterious than we ever imagined. Join us next time on Scary Sagas for other spine-chilling true stories.